This is the TekWars podcast, and we have Michael Millerman here with us, a very special guest, a translator of Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin's work, and also otherwise a very interesting philosopher outside of Dugin's work in political theory otherwise. And we're going to start with the assumption that a lot of y'all either know who Alexander Dugin is or can look up his basic background. Because we have the authoritative, one of the authoritative scholars on his work, and we're just gonna jump right into it. So, Michael, how did you get to where you are, even outside of Dugan, in your political thought, in your pedagogy of the subjects that you teach, and why you teach them?
Well, first, thanks for having me on your show. I appreciate it. I first heard about Dugan when I was an undergraduate studying philosophy at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. I was studying, I had some time to reflect on what it was about my first philosophy professor that made him so much more outstanding than the other professors I had during the program. And as I did that, I discovered a connection to a scholar of the history of political philosophy. Some of you may know Leo Strauss. So he was never explicitly taught to us, but I pieced together that my first philosophy professor was a Straussian. So I began getting into Strauss's writings, into his students, and eventually started reading a journal that was established in Straussian circles called Azur. It's called, actually, the full title is Azur Ideas for the Jewish Nation. And it had some articles about foreign policy and political theory. And in that, by the way, if any of you know Yoram Hazony, he wrote The Virtue of Nationalism most recently, a book much discussed in conservative circles. He was co-founder of this journal, Azur. And there I read an article about Dugan. That was my first time hearing or reading anything about him. It's called Alexander Dugin, Prophet of the New Russian Empire. And I recommend it as reading. I thought it was riveting then. And it also matched some pre-existing interests that I had. So, for example, the article said that Dugan had been in some mystical or occult circles in the 80s in Russia. And even before I entered university, I had my primary interest was in mysticism. What I most related to was to the mystics. And I got a taste of that in my first year of philosophy, but then it sort of fell by the wayside because mystics aren't really taken seriously or discussed much in those contexts, especially in like analytical departments. So when I saw that when I saw that Dugan had a background in mysticism and occultism, and also he was presented in this article as being something like a philosopher king for Russia, and there were other components of the presentation of him in that article, it just was so intriguing to me, that I had to dig in a little bit deeper. So I Googled him and I found out about his fourth political theory idea. I heard him lecture on it, and it helped me to make sense of some things I was experiencing at the university. So I can tell you later how it did that, but that's basically how I encountered him. In like the broader context, I would say there were two key things. So the first one is that I have an interest, I developed it like in my undergraduate years, an interest in the question of how metaphysics and politics are related. So how do our ideas about metaphysics configure our understanding of political life? Or conversely, how do different ways of understanding politics imply different metaphysical presuppositions? So Dugan came to light in part in that context. And then also, like I say, with an interest in, I was studying Plato, so philosopher kings and mystics, and it was the perfect time. I should say too, my family is from the former Soviet Union, so I spoke some Russian growing up in the household. And before I'd ever heard of Dugan, I already had an interest in Russian mystics like Vladimir Solovyov. That's how you say it. So Dugan just fit like these 3 or 4 different themes perfectly when I first encountered him. And then I ran with it. And in a way, I still am running with it.
That's very interesting. So the reason I actually came upon Dugan is, and probably similar to a lot of like our viewers here, is that he kind of like on internet, image boards, a lot of people post about him. But, and a lot of people will, go on to then actually do some like legitimate, like, search engine looking up, right, on these folks. But the main thing that was interesting to me was how much he draws on like actual anthropologists post-Enlightenment, and how kind of the style of anthropology that they do is a split in how the Enlightenment shaped the way that we do sociology. And so it's always looking back on like primitivist societies, right? In a lot of ways. So not just Strauss, not just Leo Strauss, but I think it's like the one that studied the Pensée Sauvage. He wrote a book on the differences in language and representation and symbolic thought. And there's a lot of other thinkers on this edge, like Clifford Geertz, right? But even like old Husserl, right? A lot of Heideggerian stuff, and like a lot of eventual philosophical descendants of Husserl and Heidegger. There's a lot of controversy associated with them because they have an inherently political belief of how their life is shaped, and it also because of real life political associations, right? For example, with Heidegger and Nazism, right? So right. So if maybe we could even start with that is you mentioned before this is that there's a larger context around books like Ethnos and Society. I said it's very encyclopedic, but you mentioned there's kind of a larger framing. Obviously, he has other books that are more, I would say, more from an Anglosphere perspective, more upfront political, like the Fourth Political Theory and his geopolitics books. Ethnos and Society is more encyclopedic, in my opinion. He has a lot of sociological definitions.
Yeah, you can even see it in a way as a textbook, in a way that the Fourth Political Theory is not a textbook. Rise of the Fourth Political Theory is not a textbook. Ethnosociology does have that feel to it.
Mm-hmm.
Go on, sorry.
So I guess my main question is that I think he probably formed these beliefs. I feel like he formed a lot of his beliefs prior to reading a lot of these readers, like say Husserl and Strauss. But he incorporates and develops this like elaborate but also pretty terse vocabulary with regard to the ethnos, the narod, and all that. Did you want to describe the larger frame that you mentioned earlier?
So let me give you a little bit of background. So first of all, it's interesting to me that he comes up in the context of some online discussions, specifically this ethnosociological part of his thought, for people who do go look into it. Because one of the things that I always thought was strange, at least in my university experience. So after my undergraduate, I went and I did a master's and PhD. I continued to work on Dugan in my PhD, and it caused me a lot of grief. I had 4 people resign from my committee. I had my dissertation supervisor resign. All of these people really couldn't handle my interest in Dugan. And so I always characterized it as like, they go and they Google his name and they see, a Facebook post that he made about Ukrainians, or they see something else and they just jump to the conclusion that he's like a Satanist, which many of them did. And these are university professors who in principle could have dug a little bit deeper. So anybody who has the patience and the stomach, or the interest to even discover that he has some knowledge about cultural anthropology, not to mention something like an encyclopedic presentation of various national schools of cultural anthropology, which is in effect what that book is. So you can break ethnosociology. So let me give you some background on the book itself. In Russian, it's a single text, Ethnosociology, 700 or 800 pages. And in English, it's broken up into 2 parts, Ethnos and Society. And I think the second volume published by Arctos recently is called Foundations of Ethnosociology, or Ethnosociology, the Foundations, something like that. But basically, the first part of the book is an overview of various national schools of cultural anthropology and so on. And then in the second half, Dugan develops his own conceptual framework for how the ethnos is the simplest society, and it has various derivatives, how they relate to one another, how we can use them for sociological analysis, and so forth. Well, if all that you knew about Dugan was his ethnosociology, I think that would justify an interest in him as a thinker. Because, first of all, he gives a pretty broad, how would you put it? Like, he has a broad overview of the schools, which is already interesting, because many people just operate within a school and don't always step back to see what the differences are, to try to correlate them, to try to contrast them, adjust them where need be. So in his own right, I think that book shows that he's a pretty interesting thinker. But something that is worth knowing if you know about ethnosociology is that it also has a place in a broader structure of his thought, as I mentioned to you earlier and as you were alluding to. So let me give you an example of that. He mentions, I think it's in the Fourth Political Theory, that if you think about, if you use a tripartite view of the human being as like body, soul, and spirit, just for a minute, you can have three disciplines that are analogous to it. So geopolitics corresponds to the body, ethnosociology corresponds to the soul, theology corresponds to the spirit. Elsewhere, he has said that the German philosopher Martin Heidegger is the deepest foundation of the fourth political theory. So in his own systematic structure, we have actually four components: geopolitics, ethnosociology, theology, and Heidegger's philosophy. I interviewed Dugan in print about his Heideggerianism, and I asked him how Heidegger relates to these other disciplines. And he said, this isn't an exhaustive answer, but it's suggestive, that Heidegger is the being towards death of each of these components. So that's something to think about. And so much of what Dugan writes, especially where you begin to draw connections between something he said in one work and something he said elsewhere, it can be more suggestive than exhaustive, as I say. But ethnosociology does have that more primarily expository feel to it. So in the broader scope of his system, it fits in between geopolitics and theology. And I can give you an example even of how it relates to his Heideggerianism. So one of the key concepts from ethnosociology, I decided to transliterate it. I didn't do this with many terms. In fact, I didn't do it with any terms other than this one when translating Dugan. The Russian word is narod. Narod has the meaning of people, but people isn't an adequate translation of it, even according to Dugan's own account. Rough analogs in other languages would be folk in German, in Hebrew, and Laos, L-A-O-S, in Greek. So I figured basically that it was worth transliterating. Well, this narod, this category of the folk or the people, the narod, is actually not just crucial for Dugan ethnosociologically, and it is crucial for him, and we can discuss why in a minute, but also philosophically, because when he writes about Heidegger, and by the way, I just have to emphasize, I mean, I do some reading groups on Dugan and some seminars on him, and I want to take the occasion here to emphasize it, that in order to understand him fully, you have to understand him, at least to an extent, and I would say to a large extent, as a philosophical supremacist or as someone for whom philosophy is of the utmost importance. So if you just focus on his geopolitics and you bracket the philosophy or the meaning of Heidegger for him or something, you'll get a more distorted view than if you bracket the geopolitics and focus on the Heidegger. Ultimately, you need everything together, but it's just crucial. So the category of the narod, or the people, for him, stands in very intimate relationship with Heidegger's notion of Dasein. In fact, he interprets Dasein als Volk, as he writes, Dasein as narod. So this existential ethnosociology based on the category of the people, or the narod, is like a key to understanding various aspects of Dugan, including his geopolitics. So you see, what I said to you in our earlier remarks was that, like, the book Ethnosociology, and this is true of a lot of Dugan's books, I would say, or statements, you get into it and it can be self-contained, but if you go deeper, suddenly it branches out into this, it reveals or discloses a world that is kind of interesting, intriguing, more or less coherent, and I just want to point that out because it's not obvious at first glance.
Right, and I think one of the most interesting entry points from a systemic perspective is the way he discusses primitive symbol systems and language. So evocative language, and as far as how his idea of the ethnos unfolds, right? And it just, like I said, it reminded me a lot of like La Pensée Sauvage, where they talk more about the acquisition of meaning, right, within folk, and how the way that was studied, like kind of forked from like Enlightenment, rational scientific thinking, where another work was, for example, like or I guess part of the Pensée Sauvage is the distinction between the bricoleur and the engineer, and like it's kind of talking about like modalities of, like, for example, work, or actuation versus, say, more, like Enlightenment, rationalist thinkers, we talk more about taxonomy, right? And I guess the way that the Dugan differentiates that you mentioned was in is reason versus intellect, right? So there's a nous, which is an intentional but pre-self-reflexive, like thinking and like bringing about, versus versus reason, which is more reflexive, correct?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. One point I want to make about his interest in the anthropologists, cultural anthropologists, and these other schools, it is crucial for him. I mean, its importance, you see it by the fact that he wrote a book on it, and the fact that the concept of ethnosociology is a part of his system. But even in the fourth political theory, he refers often to the insights of the cultural anthropologists as being a key component of distancing ourselves from the view of Enlightenment rationality, from unipolar Western globalism, hegemony, all of those types of things, the dominance of liberalism. As important as Heidegger is to him, cultural anthropologists are, let's say for our purposes, this is not strictly speaking correct, but they're equally important. I mean, he thinks that that mode of studying societies. And so, for example, right now I'm reading some of he's got a series of books called Noomachia, the Battle of Nous, War of Nous, okay, Wars of Nous, basically. And even there, when he talks about the importance of creating distance from our contemporary understanding of space and time, basically, seeing ourselves as standing at the peak of modern Western history and judging everything that came before as somehow underdeveloped or inadequate. One of the key ways that he creates a distance or suggests creating a distance is by focusing our attention on the methods and on the researches of cultural anthropologists. So it is vital for him. And not just the linguistic aspect, which you point out, the study of the use of language in more primitive societies or in simpler societies. If you remember in Ethnosociology, I have to tell you the truth, I don't actually know whether it came out in Volume 1 or Volume 2 in the English translation, okay? So I'm not sure whether it's in Ethnos and Society or in the other volume. But he talks about the transformation of language in global society, right? He compares it to the transformation of language in national society and all of these different components.
So the way he traces that, is what really interests me, because he traces it in a very almost material historical context of, like, for example, going from hunter-gatherer cultures, right, to like castle-centered agricultural powers, right? And so, or different traumas causing the generation of the Narod or ethnos, like the nomadic, right, Laos, the generation, right? But it's very interesting to like see if, like, the way he actually describes it ends up using a lot of material kind of historiography as far as like how techne and like how differences in power differentials shaped the ethnological process.
Yeah, I don't think he's opposed to the use of those types of methods or to taking on a question from different perspectives. So elsewhere, he'll trace the shifts in language from a more metaphysical or ontological perspective. And we can find both approaches interesting, try to understand to what extent, if any, they can be correlated to one another. And he himself will, we can ask him, to provide an answer of the correlation. And I did when I interviewed him. I said, you treat people in one way in ethnosociological analysis, you treat it from a different perspective in your Heideggerian analysis. How do you see their deeper correlation, these two approaches, right, to the study, let's say, of society? And he didn't have, I wouldn't say that he had a satisfactory answer. It doesn't mean that we can't fashion one, right? But yeah, he's not unwilling to use those kinds of analyses and methods and approaches. So that gives him a lot of content, and then it's as I say, it remains a task to correlate those different approaches to see whether they can be made to fit together. So, for example, like if he, as you say, right, he does the type of analysis he does in ethnosociology, he does a different type of analysis in his Heideggerian books, and is there an overlap or isn't there, right? Are they compatible or not? And are they both necessary or not,
Right. So how does...
Can I just add one thing on the topic of language and the importance of language for him? So I can only say this roughly, okay, because I haven't read it recently enough to go into the full detail. But he has So he has a series of books called Noomachia, as I mentioned, right? Battle or Wars of the Intellect. It's his way of studying what he calls civilizational multipolarity. So the idea that there are many different civilizations, they can't be put under one standard, right? Like the Western European rationality and so on. Our tools for studying them are derived for him in part from Heidegger and these other disciplines. So this big, massive project, it's like more than 20 volumes, I think, okay? And the first 2 volumes are methodological. They set out his idea that there are 3 logoi, you know, as part of like is basically comparative noetic civilizational analysis, that type of thing. It's actually pretty interesting. Well, he says the pre-volume to that whole project is something called In Search of the Dark Logos. It's another one of the untranslated works, okay? In Search of the Dark Logos.
Right.
For him, Dark Logos is Dionysus. It's sort of the underground, mystical, half-concealed approach to philosophy and mythology, as opposed to like the, as he puts it, solar, heroic, vertical figure of Apollo. So there's like an Apollonian history of philosophy and there's a Dionysian history of philosophy. In Search of the Dark Logos is looking for the Dionysian history of philosophy. It's a call towards Dionysus. And the book begins, strangely enough, I think, with a Russian linguist, and I believe, as I say, I haven't read it in a while, I think is a Russian linguist, and 3 different linguistic models. So the very first step towards the Dark Logos and the search for Dionysus in this book is actually structural linguistics and different modes, different modes of organizing them. I wish I had read it recently enough, if I knew it was going to come up here, that I can actually walk through what they are. But I only point that out for like the importance of the linguistic question at the forefront of that search for Dionysus, which is just kind of unexpected.
So the linguistic treatise, would it be something that would be at home with like orthodox Anglosphere structural linguistics analysis, like, you know?
I don't know well enough about about that to say, but basically it's that there were like 3 different linguistic models. In some of them, the 2 concepts are taken as polar opposites. In another one, there's something like a gradient between them. And in another one, there's neither a gradient nor are they opposites. They're somehow like just rest on the same plane without a tension, something along those lines. And he correlates that Russian linguists' tripartite model eventually to this broader tripartite model of the 3 logoi, Apollo, Dionysus, and Cybele, or the Black Logos. But again, that's just to say that the linguistic question would have to be important for him in order for him to open the book in Search of Dionysus on that and not some other topic. And the book closes on Heidegger, so it kind of takes you full circle from language and linguistics to Heidegger.
It's very interesting.
Sorry, let me just mention one other thing too, if I can. So
sure, go for it.
This again is about language and Heidegger. Is it okay? I mean, I don't want to overemphasize. If there are other places you'd like to take the conversation, but so Dugan has a couple of books on Heidegger. Okay, and the second one, not translated yet into English, called Martin Heidegger: The Possibility of Russian Philosophy. The question of language is particularly important there because he says that if you take Heidegger, so his first book is basically like an introduction to Russian speakers of Heidegger's thought that he thinks is more adequate than the introductions that were made in the Soviet period. Okay, he thinks those ones are pretty much worthless. So for the most part, he translates Heidegger into Russian there, or uses just transliterates the German. But in the second Heidegger book, he says, look, we can't do that anymore because now we have to ask the question whether a translation of these terms is possible at all. So does being mean the same thing in Russian and English and in German? Or, you see, does the whole ontological territory change together with the language, as it were? Okay, and his analysis of Heidegger's terminology in Russian suggests to him in that second Heidegger book that actually the Russian relation to being is different, is ontologically, existentially, metaphysically different than the German and English relationship to being as reflected in the language. So that's one thing. And he also traces, for example, the shifts in the Russian verb to be and in other key Russian words from Church Slavonic to contemporary Russian, basically, you see. So even attending to the way the language changed, as I say, from from the early formulations through Church Slavonic to modern Russian is for him not just a sign of linguistic changes, but a sign of, like I say, deeper ontological structural changes. So that whole domain is fair game. All the tools of linguistic analysis and linguistic history are for him on the table. Moreover, I mean, he identifies, there are some complicated nuances here, but you can say that he is a Eurasianist, okay? Mm-hmm. More technically, in his own self-presentation, he's a neo-Eurasianist. Well, as he explains it in his own writing, why is he a neo-Eurasianist? Because he takes the original insights of the Eurasianist Russian emigres, he enriches them or supplements them with the discoveries of 20th century geopolitics, philosophy, postmodern philosophy, and so on. So all of the riches of 20th century thought enriches the original insights of the Eurasianists, and therefore is like neo-Eurasianist, okay? Well, when he gives you an account of the original Eurasianists, he says they were the teachers. I mean, I can't remember the exact figures who taught whom, but I think it was like Pyotr Savitsky was the teacher of Levi Strauss or something like that. In other words, there's a direct link between the original Russian Eurasianists and the school of structural linguistics. You see, so it's not just he happens to have an interest in it. It's essential to the relationship between the original Eurasianism and neo-Eurasianism.
So can I ask something about that? Is that
yes.
Say a lot of the philosophers from the Western Europe, like more instead of like say England, right, or the Scottish philosophers, or even French or German anthropologists, say like during the Victorian type era, comparing them to the Russian or turn of the century Russian anthropologists or Russian influencing anthropologists like say Husserl, it's not like the Russian anthropologists are very reflexive because, for example, notice they analyze a lot of like populist movements within Russia and like peasant movements, and then also like primitive quote unquote primitive peoples living within Russia. Whereas say the Victorian anthropologists, so to say, like whenever they analyze like quote unquote primitive societies, they're usually like looking at like say like Latin America, Africa, the colonies that they all have, right? How is that shaped? Do you think that there's that self-reflexive kind of reason at play within how the Russian philosophical tradition has developed from the phenomenologists?
I'm not completely sure. Okay, so I don't feel like I can answer that confidently, but it's possible that if one school of thought sees the archaic or the primitive as outside of itself, and another society sees the archaic or the primitive as within itself, that would give rise to two different sociological self-analyses, right? I mean, that's plausible. And the fact that, at least for Dugan, Russia does contain the primitive and the archaic within itself, that is almost axiomatical for him. So in the second Heidegger book and elsewhere, because he's written a whole book called Archaeomodernity. Archaeomodernity is the sociological structure of Russia, that it's simultaneously, domestically, modern and pre-modern. So if you thought that the pre-modern was outside your borders, I think that you would have a different sociological analysis, a different self-understanding, a different methodology, probably even a different world picture as concerns the relation of nations and cultures, civilizations, and so on. But yeah, so Dugin sees the primitive and the archaic in Russia, but as something to, so you might say, okay, from the point of view of progressivist position, if you identified the primitive within yourself, the goal would be to develop it. But in Dugin's analysis, once you've identified that Russia has an archaic and a modern pole, the goal is actually to explode or get rid of the modern pole and to liberate the archaic pole. So his whole philosophical operation, as far as Russian society is concerned, is to liberate what's archaic or primitive in Russia against what's modern in it.
All right.
And incidentally, I mean, he wants to, as part of a project that goes beyond Russia, he tries to offer, the methodological resources for other cultures and civilizations to do something similar.
Right. So relating that to like online internet culture, that's actually a common theme you'll see is that a lot of conservative movements are kind of like archaicist revivalist kind of in how they shape their language and how they even, you know, write literature, right, and put things out.
Yeah, so can I just say something about that? I don't mean to, you know, to jump right in, but I have to clarify. So first of all, you'll have to tell me, like, you know, because you know I don't really spend a lot of time checking to see, you know, how the archaic is depicted in those contexts. But I can tell you that Dugan is not saying, when I say he wants to liberate the archaic in Russia, he doesn't. It's a crucial distinction for him through and through. He doesn't mean I want to roll back the clock to some old way of speaking or old way of dressing or, you know, old mode of self-presentation. The archaic for him has a philosophical significance. And actually, even if we think about if we distinguish two kinds of return, so two attitudes or postures toward time, and therefore two different modes of return. One mode that wants to roll back the clock, you see, to an earlier time, and another mode that wants to, as it were, abolish time. You know, that what's archaic is what's ever present after the abolition of time, versus the archaic just being the old, you know, what the ancient. So Dugan analyzes both approaches to time. One roughly you could call, I mean, this is not strictly speaking so, but I say roughly, is like a traditionalist view that we got to go back to some older traditions. And another one is somehow like revolutionary conservatism. We need to abolish time and let the ever-present origin make itself felt again. And if we have those two distinctions, he has said, again, in the interview that I did with him about Heidegger, that the first phase of his thought was traditionalist, also called Apollonian for him. And the second phase of his thought, where he discovered Heidegger, became Dionysian. So for him, the liberation of the archaic definitely is more along the lines of abolishing time than of, you know, like I say, let's dress like we did in the 16th century or something like that.
Right. So on that note, like a lot of what he kind of like talks about in interviews whenever trying to relate it to something the public can understand is talking about like something kind of fantastical like transhumanism, right? Because the main concern, right, is technological and art versus the technological things that have emerged versus the archaic. And Heidegger has discussed a lot of that, but there's also a lot of interesting international, there's like, for example, there's Chinese and Japanese political philosophers who've gone back and looked at Heidegger and talked about, okay, you know, how do we reconcile technics, right? That kind of thing. And Dugan, oddly enough, for all of his, you know, he's denounced the internet and he's denounced a lot of technology, but he's used, like, the internet is like what he's used almost exclusively to get, you know, his audience. And he's extremely technically, you know, ratiolated, you know, in how he delivers things. Which is it's very it's an interesting paradox, you know, which makes him interesting more than anything.
Can I just add to that? Like, I mean, when I first discovered this, I thought it was pretty interesting. You may know, and your viewers may know, but this is about his savvy, his internet savvy, right? So he's got like, I don't know, 20 websites, you know, in this network that's trying to push the various components of a new worldview. And it's pretty interesting. Like some people, they can go to one of his sites. I mean, you don't know right off the bat, I guess, that they belong to a network, right? And that's like a very well thought out technological internet warfare type strategy, right? But you can land on one page and it will be like, political propaganda of a very low sort. And then you go to another page and it's his Moscow State University lectures on 24/7 repeat. And then you go to another page and it's like, a school of Neoplatonism, and then you go to another page, you know what I mean? And it's all like firing on all fronts, from the most vulgar political propaganda to pretty relatively sophisticated philosophical writings. And it's part of like a conscious internet war strategy. You know, and one other thing too, sorry, just I gotta say, like if you ever have seen, your viewers may well have seen some of his like Moscow State University lectures or something like that. So on one hand, you know, it's just a professor sitting at a desk in a pretty, you know, like unadorned room, right? But they put the additional production in where they're like, you know, all of the back, like, you know, it's like you're at some sort of electronica concert with, you know, this. So
I've seen the
high production value.
Yes, I've seen the productions, but it's kind of vulgar to do this, but like, you know, it really is true that like, to compare it to some other productions in the American political sphere where they similarly have these weird networks of video production websites that are just like completely glammed up, and they're usually selling some sort of product with it, and it's even people who are not even like super edgy, but like, I don't know, political and lifestyle philosophers. I won't mention them by name, but the ones selling books, like that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But sorry, I have a cough. But talked about the material. So like I said, the paradoxes, and like he kind of mixes material history, technical language with what he sees as an inherently mystical worldview. Mm-hmm. One of the interesting things I found was so he goes over a lot of civilization in Ethnosociology. He goes over a lot of older civilizations like the Akkadians, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, and then also nomadic peoples like the Mongols, the Turks, other nations, and talks about nomadicism in the generation of the Narod from the ethnos, which is like these events, right, that happen that somehow separate, right, peoples, and like that's probably one of like the most inherent generating event, right, because everyone like there's like kind of a dissipative history, right, of like peoples, right, separating, right, from a rational worldview, right, of like the histories of peoples, right. Mm-hmm. I guess so. How whenever you talk to students, and you talk to so you teach in Canada, right? You have a lot of people coming from all these different places. How do you in your own pedagogy, do you like to talk to your students about how you see or what you'd like to hear about, like the history of their own places, right?
Well, okay, a few things I got to say about that. So I'm not teaching at the moment. I mentioned I had a little bit of an issue at my university. Mm-hmm. The issue wasn't like with my my work or how I was teaching, because for 5 years I was a teaching assistant, and it was great with the students. Like, it couldn't have been better. The relationships were good, the feedback was great, and all of that. But I'm effectively blacklisted from teaching in North America, to be honest.
All right.
So I am no longer in academia, but I have started doing like reading groups and seminars on my own time, sort of like a private university type thing. Mm-hmm. But I can say that even when I was at the university, maybe it's because of my strong departmental prejudice, or my prejudice in favor of like political philosophy, as opposed to cultural anthropology as like my primary area of interest and expertise, and what I think is like the key in a way to understanding the relevance of these other things for Dugan. So when I interacted with other students, well, let me put it this way. A lot of the students who came up to me, if I ever had a chance to let myself come through, which you don't always have, in academia, a lot of times I had students come to me and they were from Eastern Europe, or they were from China or somewhere, and they were like, wow, we never knew how deeply ingrained Western liberal propaganda was, until we took Paul 101, basically, right? Where like everything is so like comically one-sided as far as the dominance of liberalism goes. Whereas at least in my discussions, I tried to point out, give as strong as a case as I could give to the critical perspectives, whatever they might be. So it wasn't so much that I was asking students like, tell me more about your cultural history, or about like the development of your civilization or your people or anything like that. It was more focused on what are the ideas that we're taking for granted, and what are the legitimate criticisms that we're leaving out of the picture. What justifies that, and what's to be gained by putting those legitimate criticisms back on the table. Right. So I always tried to operate like at that level, respectfully. And even in my my main work, my dissertation, was a comparative study of receptions of Heidegger in political theory. So it included Dugan's, because Heidegger is so big for Dugan, but also Leo Strauss's, Derrida's, Richard Rorty's.
There's a huge canon of like philosophers from all kind of angles, like either like language techniques or on just classics like Plato, right? That you kind of emphasize the back to basics. And one of the things I was going to ask is, how has like reading Dugan influenced how you reread Plato or Strauss or these others?
That's actually something that was so unexpected for me about reading Dugan, because again, I don't know how much exactly your viewers know, so maybe you just think he's a cultural anthropologist, or maybe you hear him about post-humanism and transhumanism, right? Or maybe something else, right, pops up, or like he's not National Bolshevism, all of the things that could come up, right? But to compare him, for example, to Strauss, because Leo Strauss, well, this sort of, you know, a very different kind of person, you know, and a very different, like Leo Strauss would not come up on online internet meme culture, I assume, right? In the way that Dugan does. And Leo Strauss never.
So
went, you know,
I'll emphasize that like a lot of the introductory things that people see usually are like Nazbol memes.
Yeah.
Like, and I mean, that's the one kind of funny thing the quote unquote funny thing I'll throw in is that they're usually very edgy Nazbol memes that, you know, or people professing to be Nazbol, but also a little less than that, like strange, like occult, or say like professedly like satanic people or new agey people, right? Like relating to some like having some of his work in weird archives because they collect like these kind of eclectic like thinkers on mystic traditions. So that's the two kind of main, you know, internet sources you see on that. But you know, I'll
so
leave
let's
it there.
if you started with that, you wouldn't expect, or I wouldn't expect, there to be a meaningful, valuable comparison to make with someone like Leo Strauss. They just come from two, and yet, you know, to my, I would say to my surprise, there is a valuable comparison to make. So, one of the ways.
So what I say, it seems really ridiculous, and it's very hard to explain to people, especially since like you can't. Like I wouldn't, for example, just show them the Fourth Political Theory or Foundation to Geopolitics or even his other things like on archaeotechny type stuff. I would show them Ethnos and Society and be like, he like despite his like whatever beliefs you may have about him, he has an extremely encyclopedic knowledge of this strange canon of anthropologists and classical, you know, philosophers.
Yeah, but like to try to convince people that we're taking seriously, for sure. So I tried in my departmental context, you know, I tried to do that with his Heidegger works. It didn't work. As soon as they Googled him and they saw that he was on the Alex Jones show, for example, that was the end of the discussion for them. So to hell with them, really. Like as far as the connection with Strauss and how I started to, you know, what I learned from Dugan about reading Plato and these other thinkers. So I would put it like this. I am a huge proponent of reading Leo Strauss. So I don't know how your viewers, you know, the people who watch and read you, what they think about Strauss, but I recommend him extremely highly. And one of the things that I learned from Strauss was a depth of getting into any particular author. So Strauss can go something that you read once and then you read it again under Strauss's tutelage or guidance, it'll just reveal so many additional dimensions. So to me, Strauss was gave me a lot of depth. But when I encountered Dugan, I thought, you know what? I'm getting a lot of breadth here because Strauss never wrote about 10, 20 different schools of cultural anthropology. And I'd never heard of Arthur Mueller Vandenbroek or Henri Corbin or all of these people I learned about by reading Dugan. And by the way,
so what he's mentioning, I just want to, I really like what you're going on, but what he's mentioning is so pretty much every paragraph of Ethnos and Society, every other paragraph or every paragraph, and sometimes in a paragraph, every sentence, he'll casually cite some author like Strauss or some, you know, random anthropologist or, you know, Clifford Geertz, you know, Husserl. He'll just like snip some random quote, and he doesn't do his style isn't where he does a whole commentary that's like a whole essay on that snippet. He just kind of casually inserts into this kind of like this web.
Yeah, which is like Leo Strauss, it's a whole book on Hobbes, a whole book on Machiavelli, you know, a whole book on one sentence in Plato, so to speak, right? It's like the depth going, but Dugan, you're like, wow, he's, even if you are, even if you're let's say you're a Nazbol or you're a traditionalist or something, and then he says like, you must read Bataille, like you've got to read Deleuze and Guattari. You know what I mean? Like that's kind of, that's very appealing to me. So the breadth of his knowledge, and he did an interview, a written interview not so long ago. I think it was like posted on Long Reads. I can't remember exactly who did it. It's really funny and interesting, you know, and he talks about himself as a metaphysical hacker and so on. But you really get the sense there of like his thirst for reading everything. He's like triple exclamation mark in this interview. He's like, there's not enough time to read everything. You just have to read, you know?
And one of the unfortunate things too is, as like, I'm sorry I keep doing this.
That's
like
fine.
A lot of kind of like, I'm not trying to like clean his name, but as far as a hermeneutical source, in the Anglosphere, like you mentioned, his initial appearances in our media is like Alex Jones. So I'm from like Texas. I actually lived in Austin, Texas, and I was actually living in Austin, Texas whenever he like he periodically would show on, just kind of like call in and talk to Alex about, multipolarity and all these things, right? But it's his he doesn't sound as smart or as intelligible speaking English. His Russian lectures are extremely long, fast, and eloquent, and jumping all these different topics. And the websites that he was mentioning earlier, that like have some of them, all the RU extension, like 4pt.su, Dugan.ru, and whatnot.
Yeah.
Platonismum, like he said, there's just these hours and hours of just like eloquent, like the same material he has in his books. Anyway, we were talking.
Yeah,
about
it is genuinely frustrating, I think, for somebody who finds Dugan to be a valuable resource or like just an interesting thinker, to have to deal with the fact that at least I think the picture is getting better because more works are becoming available in English. I myself have tried to give not a generous, but like a fair account of him as a serious thinker. But before then, he didn't make it easy, right? In his English language interviews.
Well,
the other thing is there's a BBC interview some people point to where he says, like, to the interviewer, he says, well, Russia has our own truth. And the interviewer's like, what do you mean? And he's like, well, you have your truth, we have ours. And a lot of people who have asked me, they're like, you can't possibly think he's a serious thinker. Like, just look at that interview. It's like schoolyard cultural relativism. And then you think, like, well, if you knew the 25 volumes of Noomachia, if you knew the existential multipolarity,
or even just in Ethnos and Society, he calls the language he uses to describe that is reason intellect, right? We have intellect. We have the pre-reflexive nous, right? But we don't have intellect, right? Which is what he mentioned, that, or Western rationality that he mentioned. But like, it's not only the Anglosphere that he's kind of like that he's obviously like been controversial with, but internationally, just because of, for example, Ukraine and just Russia's international activities and kind of his association with that.
That's true. I mean, a lot of people say, for example, as far as the critics who think about this stuff, right, or even know his name, they will focus on his activism, right, or he's an agent, he's an operative. Here he is in Italy, right. Here he is in Brazil, here he is in Bannon, or whatever.
Not only
right?
that, but it's hard for, say, it's also hard for, say an American classical Catholic theologian or Christian to cite him, like, politically, because he has strange, like, what would be considered like New Agey almost beliefs here in America that would be interpreted that way. Like, he's involved with some sort of like chaos magician movement earlier on and that kind of thing. So he's like, he'd be like, there's all sorts of strange barriers, like, for him not being taken seriously. But sure. He's a kind of like a wily coyote as far as running around and collecting all these justifications for his worldview, right?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there are a lot of obstacles. He is very eclectic. The people who have taken the time to get to know him, like Charles Clover, a journalist who wrote a book called Black Wind, White Snow. I think it's called. Did I get that right? Anyways, something along those lines. If you read the part of his book on Dugan, it's like, on one hand, very sympathetic to Dugan as this intellectually eclectic person. I think that probably comes across to anybody who gets to know him well as a thinker, through interviews and so on. But definitely there are these obstacles. And I always thought it was, okay, so suppose that you look him up and you see not just that he's into chaos magic and, not just that he's in meme, a figure in meme world and so on, but also that he has these other books. So to just say that you're faced with that fact, right? So some people, even some like, intelligent, professionals, what they do is they just collapse everything into the lowest possible interpretation, right? So faced with this multi-dimensional reality, they collapse everything to its worst possible interpretation, right? And the problem there is that it's actually a puzzle. How do these things coexist? Like, how does the same person who wrote a pretty good book on Heidegger, like, I'm telling you as a doctor of political philosophy who wrote my dissertation on Heidegger, that Dugan stuff on Heidegger is pretty good. It's better than a lot of his critics' readings of Heidegger and so on, right? How does this same person coexist with, you know, the mimetic warfare Dugan, right? It's not easy for everyone to understand how those piece together. In fact, just to show you the difficulty, my former dissertation supervisor once suggested that I am the author of Dugan's first Heidegger book, because he couldn't conceive of Dugan having written it. So he said, I must have written it, you know, which is kind of interesting, I think. But yeah, like, in fact, in Dugan, he's complex enough that these things coexist, and therefore it's actually a puzzle to try to understand how they relate to one another.
I don't mean to justify any of his geopolitical actions or beliefs this way, but comparing him to like a legitimately older figure in history, like say some sort of European radical, you know, reformist or noble person during like, you know, medieval times or the Renaissance, almost like you find like, so like, you know, Pierre Caron de Beaumarchais, like you have like more inherently geopolitically extreme people in, you know, such an a country that's been so politically unstable over the years, like Russia. So it is like easy for, I guess, for Americans to judge you know, people like Dugan. That doesn't completely justify, you know, everything he does, but
yeah, one thing just as far as the American audience goes of his thought. So he has a book in English. I think it's just like a combination of various disparate writings. It's Eurasian Mission, that's the title of it. And he's got a section there called The Prospects of the Fourth Political Theory in the United States. Okay. So, and he acknowledges that his ideas are least likely of all to take root in the United States for various legitimate reasons. But he says, if they were to have an audience in America, it would be on, you know, for these three different in these three different formats. Like one would be if an American thought of themselves not as the New World, but as the periphery of Europe. Right? Because then you could include yourself in the whole analysis of European history and of European philosophy, and suddenly that gives you access to the insights of the fourth political theory. But he even says, like, I mean, I wish I could pull out the passages and read them, but almost kind of like American New Age thought could be a version of the fourth political theory, and American existentialist thinkers who confronted death, you know, and nihilism, also could be an entrance point to Dugan's thought, because a lot of it has to do with our facing death.
Right. I will say on this is that there's actually a Democratic political campaign, what's it called, candidate, right, named Marianne Wilson, who's basically, the language he uses is like a literal like analog of the idea of the ethnos, because she talks about like people losing their meaning and all these other factors behind American social decline, with that same kind of anthropological, sociological, you know, symbol meaning, you know, type systems. But we can continue getting deep into Dugan and other philosophers, but I wanted to, before we kind of like start to wrap it up, at least, I wanted to get more into your own pedagogy and how all these people that you've read and, you know, interconnected and reread have influenced how you teach or taught and what you currently work, you know.
Okay, well, let me just say again, so if Leo Strauss for me was the source of, like, the primary source for me to learn about depth and how to read an author carefully and slowly, and how to identify what the great books are and how to treat them with the appropriate care. I mean, I have to give so much credit to him and to his students for instilling that in me. Dugan gave me a sense of breadth, of the mystical and the initiatory and the Dionysian in a way that's absent from Strauss. You know, so Strauss reveres.
It's like a map. It's almost like a map that he has as far as what's in ethnos and society. He has literally visual topology, topographic maps
all the time. Even in his No Omachia books, he has, for example, he speaks about them. He speaks about various logoi as philosophical countries with their own geometries, and he always uses circles and triangles and mapping, like how things relate to one another. In that sense, he's a very spatial thinker. Right. And in fact, he said, let me just put this on the record. He said that, you know, Heidegger has his book Being in Time. He said that if there were to be an analogous book for a Russian thinker, it would be Being in Space, because of the importance of spatiality for the Russian Dasein.
And that's, I guess, there's another reason for American philosophers to not like him as much, is they tend to be more analytical and furthermore literary. Like, they'll criticize a lot of, say, for example, the French post-structuralist or deconstructionist for using like graphical notation or these weird kind of drawings and these assemblages, right? Or these strange kind of art, kind of insertions of maps of, ideas. Like I think Deleuze did it to some extent, but like in with his words. But anyway.
Yeah, so, I would assume that at least among mainstream schools, so setting aside the people who are just satisfied to see him as a notable meme or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. The analytical school is not likely, to have a big uptake. But
that's true. They haven't even gotten that deep. They haven't even gotten to that level of like thinking that he has that. But like seriously, if you actually read him, right, like it's this very strange, like how the different like forms of eloquence he attempts in expressing his idea.
Definitely. I
think
that
like I said, going back to your pedagogy.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, here's the thing. My undergraduate study was in philosophy. My graduate study was in political philosophy. The key question for me is the relationship between philosophy and politics. So the whole history of political philosophy, which basically I read as being concerned with the question of the relationship between philosophy and politics, the meaning of the philosopher for society, whether politics is primary, whether philosophy is primary, in which way, how even the combat over the definition of what philosophy is. You see, so much of what interests me about Heidegger is that he puts the question of the decision of the essence of philosophy up for us again. Also, as I mentioned at the outset, my initial interest before I'd heard of any of these people, Levi-Strauss, Leo Strauss, Dugan, well before I heard of any of them, I was reading mystics. Well before I was in university or knew I was going to university, I was reading mystics of different traditions: Islamic mystics, Sufi mystics, Kabbalistic mystics, Christian mystics, atheistic mystics, so to speak. Right. And that is for me the soil for everything else. So it's kind of a combination of mysticism, philosophy, and politics and their configuration. And the last thing I'll say is the importance of the conversion experience in this whole question. So Dugan has had a conversion experience, and there are other philosophers that you have to read as having had a conversion experience. Yeah, yes. And how that configures their understanding of, their world configuration, their understanding of society.
Authors in general, not just political philosophers too.
Yeah,
right?
That could very well be. Again, this is just the domain that I know best and relate to most closely, but even more broadly, like that, having undergone some sort of conversion or transformation. If I were to have done a major work after my dissertation, it was going to be on conversion. You know, so now I have some other things up in the air as I say on the side, outside of academia, but that's really like the nexus of my interests. And all of my teaching, when I teach Dugan in my online seminars and when I taught anything in political science, I do everything that I can in my power to try, first of all, to try to have the concepts be clear, to try to have the relationships be clear, the alternatives be clear, but also to somehow prepare the way for what the people that mean the most to me seem to have experienced, which is some sort of like encounter with being or inner illumination or like philosophical thinking as a mystery rite, that type of thing. So yes. I'm not a magician to be able to have that happen for people, right? But to be able to create an environment where that's possible, as opposed to reading these thinkers like they're nothing, dismissing them like you already know them, treating them like they're garbage, and basically making it impossible to have that type of experience. I fought with my heart and soul, and I still do in my own seminars, against that deadening effect of high-minded bullshit pedagogy, and try to reopen the mystery, whether it's of Plato or of Strauss or of Dugan.
Right, and so let me just say, are we good for another about 15 minutes?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
All right. So on that note, his relation to mysticism. So, like I will say that one of the things he reminded me a lot of reading and going back to rereading now, having read Dugan, is Islamic theology and Islamic mysticism, right? And a lot of the language and vocabulary and kind of doing cross-comparative analysis with that. And so that it is very, very comparative in a way, which although he is against globalism in many ways and pro multipolarity, he is very similar to the way that Western Europeans have done, and Americans especially, have done comparative mythology, for example. So like Campbell, for example, and a lot of the early semioticians had somewhat similar systems that were post kind of Enlightenment with regards to how they treat language, right?
Yeah, all of the resources of comparative study are available, whether they were developed in the West or outside the West. The only thing that has to be kept out of the picture is after the comparison, the unidirectional evaluation. But about the Islamic mystics and about, you know, his own conversion experience, so there's a key figure for him, a scholar of Islamic mysticism. I think you pronounce it Henri Corbin, Henricorbin. And he's a crucial figure for Dugan in many respects. He was a scholar of Islamic mysticism, and he was also the first person to translate fragments of Heidegger into French. And he straddled that line between Heideggerian existentialism and the serious study of Islamic mysticism, Sufi mysticism. And he's a model for Dugan of the way that you can have this transposition or translation of models. And I have to say, again, this is not to be like an apologist, sort of like you yourself are wary of being, right? But if the only thing I ever learned from Dugan was that there's a scholar named Henri Corbin who writes about Islamic mysticism, because I read I read one of this guy's books on Islamic mysticism, and it's great, but he never came up in another context for me. You know?
Yeah.
So Islamic mysticism definitely is important.
And another thing too is just not the detail and the breadth of what he covers, but I would never be able to connect and make sense of some of the authors he cites had he not been explained in his language. And I'm sure that somehow shapes my perception, but at least it does give some sort of starting material for making understandings of how certain materials can be used and how, you know, what kind of maps of meaning, you know, they provide and whatnot.
Absolutely. About his own conversion experience, I just want to say again for anybody who may want to follow it up after, so it's like, you know, I brought it up and where can somebody get the original source for it? So in his book, In Search of the Dark Logos, so it's not translated, but there's an excerpt that is translated. And I think if you search the metaphysics of pain and the radical subject, that's the relevant excerpt. And it comes in the context of his study of this Dionysian history of philosophy, as I mentioned earlier. But he says that he himself in the 80s found himself in the middle of, in a situation where he rejected everything around him. And he explains that, like, you know, it wasn't like I had some ethnic or religious reason to be rejecting it. I was straight up Soviet, and my parents were straight up Soviet. I was basically as Soviet as you can get. And yet somehow in the depth of this experience, I was totally and utterly disgusted with everything. Okay. And he writes about that. And he says, if you go have a look at that, those passages, he specifically describes the discovery within him of something that later he correlates. Like, you can see that he had this experience that he's tried so hard to make sense of, that he correlates what emerged out of that dark night for him with figures from Hermeticism, from Gnosticism, and from Heidegger, and he elaborates it into his own conceptual schema using this notion of the radical subject and its double. That's another name of his book. So if you trace, like he says, okay, in his No Omachia books, he says, to read a philosopher, you have to read them with like the deepest philosophical empathy. If you're an atheist and the philosopher talks about God and the angels, you can't just reinterpret that into your atheistic understanding. You must try to inhabit the life world of the philosopher in the same way that a cultural anthropologist, through participant observation, tries to bracket his self-understanding for the sake of learning about the society that he's observing. You have to do the same thing, he says, with philosophers. And you arise from their self-understanding to their conceptual, logical schema in a way that is like full of philosophical empathy. Well, if we take seriously that invitation and we apply it to Dugan himself, then we have to in some way understand his search for Dionysus and his notion of the radical subject and all these other things as stemming to an extent from this crucial conversion experience that he had in the 80s in Moscow when everything lost its meaning for him. And that even those passages, again, they are available in not the greatest translation, but still they're available in translation in English, Metaphysics of Pain and the Radical Subject. They also distinguish his path, because a lot of people say, okay, some people who know Dugan, they just interpret him as geopolitics. Okay, that was when I came on the scene in 2011. That's when I started translating Dugan. Most of the literature was about his geopolitics. The ethnosociology and theology, that was missing. Okay, it's changed now. But if some people who search for him now, they see that he's a traditionalist. Well, in that writing, he distinguishes his conversion experience into the radical subject from traditionalism. He specifically says, when everything loses its meaning for you in the way that it did for me, there are two paths you can take. You can go the road of traditionalism, or you can go this other road. And I went on this other road. So if you encounter him thinking he's a traditionalist, and then you read these passages, or in the interview I did with him in Heidegger, where he says, I used to have, be Apollonian traditionalist, and then I went Dionysian. Those are like key ways of distinguishing, so that we can, with philosophical empathy, understand his path. So yeah, like he clearly has had, and not only has he had a conversion experience, if not more than one conversion experience, he always writes about philosophy and about thinking, including there's on 4pt.su, there's an entry relatively recent called Notes on Thought, I think. He treats the act of thinking at its peak as a conversion experience. To think in its proper and fullest sense, in its philosophical sense, or in its purest and rawest sense, is to expose yourself to transformation. So that is just clearly reflects an experience that he has had, if not more than one, and is a key to accessing what's interesting about his works. Another key, there are many locks and many keys. That's just another one of them.
Right. All right. So, like I said, I love talking about Dugan, but with regard to, say, for example, how do you explain material to your own students? Right. Obviously, you've touched a lot on tracing histories and cross-reference and different anthropological techniques, right?
Yeah, I would say like Strauss's pedagogy for me is more important than Dugan's pedagogy in terms of how I would work with students. So the idea is that, again, the kind of thing that I would teach when I work with students is let's read a book together, whether it's Plato, whether it's Dugan. So it's very much book focused. Okay, we're reading books. So there are some classes, if people have had the experience of going to a university, where the syllabus will be like 30 different articles from 30 different journals, like it's, what I'm saying? Like it's article focused. That's not the approach that I follow. It's not the approach that I think works best, or the approach that I'm best suited for. Mine is very much like, let's take a book or an essay and go through it very slowly, okay, very carefully, with the highest degree of philosophical empathy that we can muster. And Strauss gave me a lot of, he modeled that for me in the way that he reads these works. And I can say that actually probably what has made, as you can probably tell, like Strauss and Dugan are two particularly important figures for me. And one of the ways that Dugan became important for me was that I read him the way that Strauss taught me to read. So Strauss said, don't be so quick to dismiss an author who doesn't seem to you like he is deep, because Strauss himself did that to Xenophon, for example. A lot of historians, as I understand, had dismissed Xenophon, who has an account. He's one of the few ancient sources who has a direct account of Socrates. But my understanding is nobody had really treated him as a serious thinker until Strauss taught people how to read Xenophon. And to see that if I can learn to read him as a serious thinker. So I did the same thing with Dugan.
If I can interject for a second,
sure.
Can I ask? You're very. I follow your Michael, your M. Millerman like Twitter, right? And you've actually gone through a lot of like openly tweeted about discussions of a lot of these ideas, and especially Strauss, and also Heidegger. But one of the kind of questions online that's discussed a lot, because especially with the internet and more distributions of foreign authors and translations, especially nowadays, is what is the kind of breadth of like how much like when should people stop reading, right? Is there ever like a point of like over literacy in regards to taking in too much theory, and what do thinkers and teachers think about in terms of like picking and economy of choosing your thinkers, and how they advise to choose and avoid.
There are figures, even esteemed figures within the history of philosophy, like Nietzsche, who say there's possible to read too much, right? And sometimes you need some breathing room, and sometimes you need to get away from that. That's probably true. And there are probably also people who you can go to if you want to be encouraged into activism and action. But my own contribution, as best as I think I'm positioned to make it, is with the side of those people who say that theory is crucial. They want, in Zizek, I include that, Zizek in it, right? So I am very much predisposed to supporting those thinkers who I might even say who overemphasize the importance of theory as a counterbalance to the prevailing approach, which underemphasizes the importance of theory. So that's number one. But then you can say, okay, is it endless reading or what? Well, I think that Strauss is right that life is too short to read any but the greatest books. Okay, there's something to that for sure. How do you decide what the greatest books are? Well, that's an open question, right? I don't necessarily think that we should get rid of Plato in order to read some arbitrary Ethiopian author just because one is Western and one is Ethiopian or whatever. You know what I'm saying? So there's a canon that's worth studying and that can continue to disclose its riches to us. And I mean, I read, as I said, like I read and encourage the reading of Dugan in the same way that Strauss encourages the reading of the other authors, which is like try to get to know them completely. And a lot of people, I mean, again, I can't speak about 20 different subjects because I isolated a small universe of texts, right? Like Heidegger, even Strauss and Dugan for me are somehow in light of Heidegger because both of them recognized Heidegger as the most eminent thinker of the 20th century, if not of many centuries,
right?
If not of millennia.
If I can say one of the things that I've seen in deciding like how your reading has been shaped a lot is a very actually classical and response and critical of classical commentaries, right? That kind of the way Dugan forms like kind of makes this vector, right? So there's this thing in statistics called like linear regression, right, where you make this kind of line right out of a bunch of points, and the kind of vector, like there's kind of a vector that's been formed with who Dugan cites and who you talk about that I can see is kind of developed like how you like the kind of direction of like thinkers that you think about. Just because if they talk about things like symbol systems, theology, sources of meaning, like historiography of societies and belief systems and that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, I can say that when I was among Straussians, and I do have an essay on this topic called In Search of Devil's Advocates or something along those lines, or Straussian witchcraft. When I was among Straussians, I encouraged them to like invert everything they know. They would never read Zizek. I said, how could you not, right? Or they would never read something crazy. Right. And I would say, how could you not? And vice versa in a way. When I'm among Duganites who, would think that to read Leo Strauss is like some sort of sacrilege, or to read, or to spend like a month reading Hobbes or something. You know
right, that's the thing. That's the thing that sucks is whenever you can't, because of someone's like whenever someone is too politically bent, someone can't get them to read sometimes for career reasons, some sort of source, or at least mention that they can, right?
Yeah. So really what motivates me, and again, this motivation is limited. It doesn't answer every relevant question. It doesn't study every relevant author. It to a large extent, as I have mentioned, and as you've mentioned, probably overprivileges theory vis-a-vis practice and so on. But what's crucial to me and what I try to convey is that there are so many fundamental questions about what is the human being and our relationship to the whole that philosophers and political philosophers have given an account of this, and that most of our reading is overly constrained by belonging to a school. And that if we can combine depth and breadth through comparative study and through various approaches in reading that I think are modeled well by Strauss, we can put ourselves in touch and it's like a humanizing effort to try to give us access to a broader and deeper expanse of the fundamental questions. I mean, that's what at the university, like you had experts in Derrida, you had experts in Strauss or whatever, right? I don't consider, now this is somewhat self-serving, okay, and it's probably a blind spot for me, but I don't consider my expertise in Dugan, or I don't intend it to be a narrow expertise in Dugan, because I intend for Dugan to open out onto a much broader and deeper set of questions. And I believe that he does. And I believe that I can show that he does,
Right. And
so I'm glad you mentioned that. It's for the sake of those questions that I'm so passionate, both about him and about Strauss.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's mainly why I was so interested in interviewing you, as far as like I said, since I think I've been following you for something like 3 years or something like that. But like I said, yeah, the readings really bring up these different like concepts and really explain them even to people with maybe a not so focused or not so specialized political science or sociological background. He can bring it. The language, at least for me, was very easy to read. That might be a bias in regards to like how much people can get from it, right? But yeah, I agree completely with with what you're saying about it opening up different sources of the thinking on this kind of subjects. All right, so we're gonna wrap it up soon. Is there anything? Do you have anything exciting in the works in your own world that you can either hint about or are excited to get on, or do you have any prospects for where you want your career to go in the future, that kind of thing?
Yeah, as far as all of this goes, and in light of what we just said, Dugan opening up onto other questions. So I have been teaching, as I mentioned, seminars and reading groups. We did a reading group on the fourth political theory that, the book is like 140 pages, and we spent 12 or more hours, going session by session, chapter by chapter into a lot of detail. So that was really satisfying. Doing a seminar on noomachia, which is very satisfying. And I have a translation underway, another translation. It's Martin Heidegger and the Possibility of Russian Philosophy. And there too, like the question of the possibility of philosophy is interesting to me, right? So what, as something that we don't take for granted, but that we actually like inquire into its preconditions and into its significance. So that's all on the Dugan side. I work full-time outside of academia. So this is like in my spare time, which I have less of than when I was in graduate school. And I don't actually know exactly what's going to be next. As I said, I'm pretty much blacklisted from university. I am pretty glad that I have students and researchers and professors.
Sound excited. So just from your social media, you sound pretty excited. Sounds like more one opportunity is closed, but you feel more independent and more free.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you have to understand, like, even this conversation that we're having, which I'm enjoying a lot, I couldn't do in graduate school. I mean, I turned down a lot of interviews. I turned down opportunities to go to other countries and speak because I was told that basically it's like head down, mouth shut, or you won't graduate. And I couldn't take that risk then. So I wouldn't really want to go back. But the great thing is that I get letters from students, like from undergraduate students, from graduate students, from professors, from researchers, from professionals. And it's great. People have a genuine interest in the work that I'm doing. And I consider myself like super fortunate to be able to do it. It just is a natural outgrowth of my interest. So it just worked out well that way. And it's not out of the question that at some point, there will be like invited speeches at universities and so on. But my days of putting out applications to teach at university are long gone. That's not really in the cards. One thing I'd like to do, so I mentioned I'm doing the seminars. I've actually talked to some other like exiled academics and dissident academics and just other academics I like about this model of teaching our seminars to students who are outside of academia. And there's been a genuine interest in that. So I have talked to like someone about teaching Aristotle, Hegel, about teaching about Western civilization. And that's actually, I would say, that's in the cards.
I will say that, like, so I noticed that, like, talking to actual, say, like a biology grad student or biology professor or philosophy student or philosophy professor, they're not as like actually very interested in talking about the work because they pour so much into it daily, like a grind, right? But I've noticed that like non-students generally enjoy talking more about the weird details of those subjects with people who have kind of like left it and gone into, say, industry, right, or consulting, right? So that just sounds like a lot along your lines.
Yeah, because our interest in it is, if we still have it, it's genuine, right? It's deep rooted.
Right.
Like, we could be in the middle. You know what I mean? Like anywhere else, you're not going to snuff out this interest in us. Whereas someone who's going through making it so routine and so on, it can have a deadening effect. And there are many constraints on what you can say and what you can't say. And it's not really compatible with, I mean, don't get me wrong, there are great professors. I had one myself in my first year of philosophy. I know people in the system that I respect, but this idea of capturing the genuine interest that listeners have and students have, and the genuine passion that like some dissident or marginalized or other academics have, and putting together like some courses or seminars or reading groups that are not led by me, but broadening, as it were, the faculty of this quasi-university. I like that idea, and it's something that I am working towards gradually.
All right, it's really cool because a lot of people in my generation are really fed up with institutions and that kind of thing, mainly because of expenses and all sorts of reasons. So it's really exciting, just like you mentioned, you and like other people going out and trying to be do more independent publishing or contract with people and private teaching. So this is
Can I
really,
just say, like, for the people who will be watching this or listening to it, I'm wide open to suggestions and feedback and like people's perspectives and stories and all of that. So if it's something that you think is interesting, there's some authors you want us to consider. Like all of that feedback, I definitely welcome it, and positive and negative. If you think the idea is horrible, you can tell me that too.
Right. So we're gonna try to transcribe this interview too, and basically every author that we mentioned and every probably most of the citations from the Dugan book that I have, I'll throw in there, because our readers like to are very very good, like really like going in and like reading all the details and stuff.
Fantastic.
So we're really glad to bring you on about this particular subject, because I know our listeners are going to enjoy it a lot. And you were very good interview partner, to talk these things over. So it's a lot that was covered. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
All right. So we're gonna hang up here in a second. Is there anything else that you'd like to shout out before we end the call?
I have my website, michaelmillerman.ca, where some of the essays that I've written about Dugan and Strauss and the questions that I think are important are there if anyone wants to look at that. You can also see what translations I've done of Dugan's and where you can get them and stuff like that. But really, I just again want to thank you for the invitation, thank your listeners, and your readers. And like I kind of hope, I don't know how this works, but if there's any discussion that comes out of it online and so on, that would be great too. Like it's good to talk to people who are genuinely interested in these things.
Yeah. There's interest. There's all sorts of really interesting networks on Twitter of feedback to different theory. You're probably going to get a lot of criticism. Like we're probably going to get a lot of criticism for talking about Dugan.
I'm looking forward to it.
And people are gonna respond to that. There's gonna be negative response to that criticism. So we'll let you know all about it. And like I said, we'll share the recording with you as well. So thank you, Michael, and thank you for everyone for listening. Everyone have a good night or a good evening. Or good morning. All right. Take care.